Good morning and welcome to the Overhaul Eagle Eye broadcast. I am joined today by a very special guest, Ron Grove from EY. Ron is a managing director at EY and he's also the global capability lead for logistics and fulfillment. Ron, welcome to the Overhaul Eagle Eye podcast.
Thank you. Excited to be here.
So, interesting times for supply chain. We are we are yet again finding ourselves in that difficult position whereby the world's eyes are on us, and we're trying to figure out what just happened and what happens next. What are your current thoughts, Ron? How are you seeing the current landscape?
I wish we could have had this conversation a week and a half ago when things were a lot clearer and more straightforward.
Right.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? A lot of the focus on kind of the geopolitical stability was typically focused on China and Taiwan things, as well as some things related to Ukraine and Russia, but obviously that's changed significantly in the last week and a half. So there's a lot of things that's a lot of directions it could potentially go, and I don't think anybody has a crystal ball just yet. So we'll see. But it ties in nicely to the overall supply chain risk conversation topic, which I think is going to come to the forefront for more and more C-level folks in the near future.
Right. So, I mean, as a capability lead for logistics and fulfillment, what conversations have you been having with your clients over the last week in terms of, my personal opinion is a lot of this is hurry up and wait. Making strategic decisions in the short term seems to be a little bit foolhardy just based on what we've seen previously, from this administration. It's like you need to give things time to settle. The rhetoric over the last couple of days has been a little bit different. There's a lot of concerns about the longevity of this conflict, but supply chains have to find some level of resilience. So what are conversations have you been having with your customers?
Well, I think it's very similar to what you said. There's a lot of just kind of hurry up and wait. And I think the biggest expected impact at this point really is going to be related to fuel prices, right? And things
Right.
like that. So it's going to be more around that because there aren't a lot of other, at least in our clients, my experience, a lot of other like manufacturing bases in the Middle East. Now, if things expand within the region, that may change. But at the moment, it's really about mitigating kind of fuel risks and costs and making sure that you've got reliability as far as transportation options as well because I think that's going to go. It's very unpredictable. I think it's going to be a significant impact, especially in the shorter term.
And as you think about, sort of the wider picture and 2026, this understanding of agility from supply chains, outside of the current impasse, but as we think about the messaging to supply chains and what they really need to focus on, and as we think about, the risks associated to supply chain in general, again, is that a similar type of message for your clients and customers in 2026, which is this is the year of agility. This is the year where you've really got to start pressing those buttons.
Yeah, I think. I mean, honestly, there's some element of it that if they're just starting to think about it now, they're too late.
Right.
And I think that's the key thing, right? We've
Right.
been kind of talking with our clients for quite a while about a couple of different elements of it, right? When I talk about supply chain risk, from our perspective, there's several different facets, right? There's kind of supplier stability, reliability, right? There's the geopolitical impacts. The one that I don't hear a lot of people talking enough about is cybersecurity. And that's not only at the organization, but also at their vendors as well, and maintaining compliance and that protections. And I had a client about 2 years ago who their TMS was subject to a ransomware attack. And in their case, it's a little bit of an atypical business model. It's a specialty discount retailer, but they were able to recover very quickly because they were prepared with a bunch of other workarounds. They had a playbook from pre-TMS implementation. They had offline systems they were able to leverage, but they were very, very well prepared for it. So the impact was not as significant and crippling as it could have been. So the whole cybersecurity piece, whether it's with the organization, the technology partners, or vendors, is one that I don't think really gets enough attention.
No, it's a very interesting point because as our supply chains have become more decentralized, from a cybersecurity perspective, you're really only as secure as your weakest link. And there's been a number of very high profile ransomware attacks to some of the biggest 3PLs and brokers in the world. And so I think you're right. I think it's something that there's probably doesn't get enough attention and probably doesn't get enough merit, but it's a major part of the agility piece. And so this is, we are at Overhaul, we're spending a lot of time on artificial intelligence, on identifying different parts of our model, doing all the right things. and some breaking ground here as well in terms of how we're thinking about the right use cases for AI and what we're doing. How much is that transforming the industry from your perspective right now?
Well, I think it's kind of an interesting point because it opens up amazing possibilities, right? Whether you're looking at it from being able to aggregate external data and information to make decisions, if you're talking about it from the perspective of building an agentic network that then can go do the decisioning, right? So you'd have AI that can get you visibility, then you have kind of the decisioning layer on top of that. And the ability to aggregate and normalize data from multiple sources, which has typically been one of the biggest obstacles when you talk about a traditional control tower application. So I think there's a lot of really interesting use cases and applications and direction for it. But at the same time, a lot of our clients are struggling to figure out, yeah, I hear that, but what does it really mean? And how do I get started? How do I start to move towards that? Honestly, some of our clients are just skeptical that they'll actually see the benefits. And so a lot of clients are taking kind of a slower approach with a proof of concept. Let's go build it, iterate it several times, right? Which we can do fairly quickly, but be able to iterate it and say, okay, now I'm starting to see the benefit. How can we scale it from there?
And it is this sort of trade-off of, fully democratized technology, access to everyone, low barrier of entry, super exciting. But I hear, we hear that a lot as well. But where do we start? And what
Mhm.
does that first step look like? And then there is that, we are in the middle of Amara's law, right? Whereby there's still a lot of naysaying in terms of benefit. And then at the same time, you're hearing, well, 40% of white collar jobs will be gone in the next 3 years. And it's very difficult to find the true balance of what this means, other than it's probably one of the biggest transformational opportunities that we've had, certainly for supply chain, in my lifetime in supply chain. So as you're talking through that conversation, where do you see that companies are getting excited? Is it forecasting and planning? Is it the TMS environment? Is it like where are companies starting to see some success, and where are people most focused?
So a lot of the focus really is in forecasting and planning, and also some of the more, like vendor management, contract management, things like that. But really, forecasting and planning, because I don't want to say none of it is straightforward, right? But if I think about that compared to orchestrating operations within a four wall of a distribution center, or aggregating a lot of external data sources through a TMS, particularly if it's not my own fleet, right? If I'm using common carriers and that kind of thing, of how do I get the data aggregated? So that the forecasting and planning is a pretty robust area of interest. Procurement as well, and on the kind of the logistics side of it, it really is, as I mentioned, kind of the on the transportation piece, whether we have a TMS or not, whether it's my own fleet or somebody's in the back room dialing for diesels, trying to coordinate everything. Some use cases around there, some of it around information of accessibility, right? So the ability to use LLMs and just query, where is this shipment, or what's the status of this? But also when it comes to scheduling and coordinating, whether it's inbound receipt, outbound pickups, and how does that tie in with any warehouse or fulfillment operations as well, is using agents to manage a lot of those kinds of things as well.
Right. And also there's a lot more is there's a lot from supply chain being absorbed into the LLMs. So things like HTS codes, for example, are now have been ingested into OpenAI and Anthropic, I think. And so this starts hopefully to give another set of opportunities to supply chain practitioners to be able to say, the LLMs, okay, there's a lot of interest in terms of the hallucination effects and everything else, and that's a whole different conversation that we could go into for days on. But there is it appears that there's now even more credibility from a supply chain data perspective, and then how can we start to really leverage that? How can we start to, my opinion has always been that supply chain, we have, the physical supply chain has always been ahead of the digital supply chain. And over the last 5 years, the digital supply chain has now caught up and surpassed the physical supply chain. And to really open up these models of federated inventory and all of the things that we've always dreamed about, the technology has never been there. And suddenly it seems to be available to us. And how do we then apply that to that physical supply chain to be able to change the way that we think about it? And it's like, okay, I need to see more traction from supply chain practitioners actually trying and using some of this technology, but there's always, the supply chain. We have to do what's on our plate today. And it's really difficult to focus on tomorrow until we get today finished. How are you treating that with, again, with your clients? Like, what are these conversations? Are people still skeptical? Or are they still thinking, because I've had these conversations, Ron, where it's like, well, remember RFID, remember
Mm.
blockchain, and those
Yep.
those are going to be the foundational turning points of inflection for supply chain, and they never were. And I'm saying, yeah, this time it's different. This time you've got a user base, you've got zero barrier of entry, the technology is democratized. So this is a better chance than we've ever had before to actually drive real transformation. Is that the conversation that you're having?
Yeah, it absolutely is. And I think you nailed it because, if I think back to RFID, right, it was the cost of all the equipment, and the cost per label, and that everybody in my supply chain had to have the readers. There was an investment for that. There was the standard, there was all of these other things. There was getting, you know, consistent harmonized data across the supply chain from all my vendors, right? And so that was very difficult to get traction, right? And there's several other examples you can look at. And like you said, what's different with AI is the cost of entry is low. It's very, very democratized, the data and the capabilities at this point. And the reality is that it enables decision making and visibility capabilities that are becoming increasingly critical. So I don't know that you can afford to not go down the path. And like you said, right, we've always had this dissonance between the physical capabilities and technology capabilities within supply chain, and that's starting to invert, right? Because now we're getting the technology capabilities with AI, et cetera, to the point where some of the physical infrastructure isn't necessarily going to be able to respond quickly enough, right? When you start
Right.
thinking about it from a resiliency and how do I respond to something or disruption or any other thing that happens within the market. So I think it's almost going to kind of seesaw a little bit back and forth, and then it'll eventually come together. And I think the other thing that the conversation we're having with our clients is there's a tendency to try to get into the mindset of how do I fit AI into this or what I'm doing today versus if you were going to be an AI forward supply chain and a clean sheet of paper, say, what would I use AI for? How would I leverage it? What would it look like? What would my physical capabilities look like in addition to the technologies? And then from there, use that as a North Star and then work backwards instead of there's a lot of people running around saying, well, this might be a good use case. So let's kind of screw in AI over there. This might be a good use case, maybe,
Right.
plug it in there versus taking kind of that non-siloed enterprise longer term view.
No, I love that. And I think you're absolutely right. I think there's a lot of, hammers looking for a nail.
Hmm.
And it's tough because whenever you try to force it, that's when it doesn't work particularly well. And that's when you start that cycle of disillusionment. And then you take two steps back instead of really understanding what are the key pain points of my supply chain and where might there be an opportunity. And then how do I think about that? But being very thoughtful about the implementation of it, but not using also that as an excuse. And this is where I see that sort of head on collision right now, which is it's easier to do nothing and watch what other people are doing
Hmm.
and wallow in procrastination. And my personal view to some of the supply chain leaders in the world is this is not a time to procrastinate. Even if you're doing the simplest things in terms of automation, that's still a step forward and it gets you comfortable with the concept. The technology is moving so fast that it's actually quite difficult even for a technologist to keep up with it. There's so many, there's something I learn actually something every single day about a new capability that I hadn't thought of before. I was like, that's really interesting. I haven't even started to contemplate how to apply that yet, Ron. But
Hmm.
I'll get to that on Wednesday. And by Wednesday, the world has shifted again. So it's
Yep.
kind of, I love that fact that we're trying to keep up, but we shouldn't use that as an excuse in terms of actually being serious about the supply chain problems that we've all had and we've all struggled to work with for years.
Yeah. I think you're exactly right. And it's very easy to get dismissive, right? There's all kinds of people who say, like, see, I told you that's why it wouldn't work, or that just doesn't make any sense, right? And I find myself, somebody who's been in here in the business for a very long time, I find myself in that trap sometimes as well. And I have to be mindful to say, nope, this is different. This is something that's honestly very different. And I think the other part of it is, as we were talking about, instead of looking at it as I'm going to go find a nail for the hammer. When we talk about AI capabilities, we talk about supply chain resiliency. A lot of the conversation is within kind of risk mitigation and flexibility. But the other conversation I don't hear a lot of people talking about is how do I take the risk and resiliency piece and also turn it into a hedge or turn it into an asset? Right.
Right.
So looking at the capabilities between all of the AI tools that are available, all of the infrastructure, all of the data that's available, and where we think some of the advancements are going to go, it's one thing to say, I'm going to focus on mitigating supply chain risk because I don't want to be caught out. I don't want to have X, Y, or Z happen. But the other lens that we're talking to clients about is to say, well, think about it if you can enable different capabilities or use it as a hedge, right? So if I can change my supplier network to give me more resiliency or expand it or diversify my portfolio that lets me be more responsive or helps me be more reliable in addition to kind of mitigating the risk just during the course of day-to-day business. So even without a disruption, it's important, I think, for folks to look at it through that lens as well. It's not just about mitigating the risk of disruption. It's how do I build a stronger operation and more reliable and more flexible, right? And that's another place all the AI tools that are starting to be so prevalent can play a role there too. If we start thinking about digital twin simulations and things like that, but have a digital twin that takes in data from the external sources as well, or looks at supplier risk or provider risk and those kinds of things as well.
I think that's super interesting because it leads into that chain of thought, which is the definition of resilience is the ability to absorb a shock. And too often what happens is building that so-called resilient supply chain means you actually start to stagnate certain parts of your technology because you're building it to absorb the shock. But in the world that we're in now, whereby we're kind of constantly having to absorb shocks, the innovative part of supply chain should be around embracing the chaos.
Hmm.
And you can embrace the chaos through the use of technology. You shouldn't build a moat. You should actually learn to swim. And
Yes.
that's the ability to do that with the technology that we have at our hands, I think is going to be the differentiator over the next 3 to 5 years for big supply chains in terms of this is the new norm. And the new norm is one that, true innovation. So a lot of the use cases that I see for AI right now are automating something that we've always done. It's
Hmm.
it's not it's not really innovation, it's automation. Doing old things in new ways. But true innovation is doing new things in new ways. And that means a complete rethink of the application of technology, how we think about supply chain, how we think about the customer and all of that. And I'm not sure that we're there yet, Ron, because we're still kind of a little bit hung up on but we still got to deliver today's orders. And it'll take us some time. But I'm starting to see the grassroots of this starting to come through in supply chain. And it is going to be, leaders like yourself who are going to continue to cultivate that and to help clients think their way through that. This is, the longevity in supply chain is beautiful because you've been there, seen it, done it, and now you're ready to actually help clients through that next wave, which may be the most important wave for supply chain that we've seen in decades.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other thing too is to make sure that we talk about we've been there, we've seen it, we've done it, is making sure that there is that practical lens and people don't get carried away as well. Everybody reads all the things or sees all the things. Oh, that's really cool. I want to go start doing that, right? And instead of, as you said, and as I had mentioned, talking about it from an AI first transformation approach and focus on what really matters for your business versus I want to try this, I want to try that, I want to try that, I want to try that. One of my clients is a specialty retailer and they do a lot of opportunistic buys. As a result of that, they have an incredibly diverse vendor base, geographically and company wise. And as a result, the things that would typically drive them or they would consider from a risk and resiliency don't apply. So the last time when tariffs were first implemented, I was having a conversation with their SVP. How concerned are you? He said, I'm not because I've got enough vendors in enough places with enough product lines. It doesn't matter to me. Right.
Right.
So their risk is focused on other pieces, other areas in their supply chain. Right. And so I think making sure that you're looking at it from a AI transformation first perspective and also what's right for your business to prioritize where to go. Because you're right, everybody's still got to ship at the end of the day. Customers are still going to call with orders and to complain. And so making sure that you've got a good prioritized approach, but a roadmap with that North Star to get there. So it isn't quite so insurmountable.
I love that. I love that. Ron, It has been an absolute pleasure. We could talk for hours, but unfortunately, we're going to draw to a close. Thank you so much, Ron Grove, from EY, for joining me today on the Eagle Eye podcast. If you like our content, please give us a thumbs up. If you don't, write to us and tell us what we could improve. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it.